I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Shirley Hung, partner, is a member of the Business Process Services team. She advises senior stakeholders of global services, including enterprises, service providers, and investors in their strategic mandates and initiatives. Rajesh Ranjan, partner, leads Everest Group's Business Process Services Syndicate and advisory practice globally. He advises senior stakeholders that include buyers, providers, and investors in their global services and enabling technology mandates and initiatives. Pratik Singh is a practice director aligned with the Business Process Services practice. Pratik's responsibilities include leading Everest Group's procurement and supply chain management, BPS membership offerings, along with providing clients with custom strategic advisory support. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rajesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thanks very much for taking time out to join us in this webinar, in this discussion. There is one deviation compared to what our introductory, what the introduction was made, in the sense that we will make it more dynamic, in the sense that we are not going to kind of take on the Q&A just towards the end. As part of the registration process, a lot of you actually provided your questions. We also expect you to share some of these questions as we go along. What we're going to try to do is we're going to take some of those questions as we go along. And of course, if time permits towards the end, we'll try to address any remaining question. With that, what we're trying to kind of share today is really kind of falls under two broad buckets, right? First, we'll try to understand the broader picture of what is happening on the recession side with a kind of a lens to BPS industry, and kind of answering two key questions. How does economic recession impact the BPS industry? And will the impact of this potential recession be different from previous ones? And then secondly, we will look at how enterprises can use outsourcing as a lever to not only successfully navigate this uncertain environment, but actually create business value for their function, their organization. With that, let me kind of, ask Shirley to kind of talk about how is she seeing this economic, recession panning out, and what is her prognosis in terms of the impact that it will have on the broader IT BPS industry, and then we'll go deeper. So Shirley, over to you.
Thanks, Rajesh. For those of you who attended our December webinar, where we showcased our findings from the 2023 key issue study, some of these slides may seem familiar to you. But because we do have many audience members here today that did not attend that event, I do want to start out by setting the economic, context that we find ourselves in currently. This slide that you see here was prepared by our fantastic financial research team. They keep an eye out on economic trends, and they perform financial analysis on the outsourcing and services market. And as you can see, all my macroeconomic indicators are really pointing to a considerable level of economic pressure and potential global recession. And we really are seeing this play out where certain geographies are already in recession, while others are heading there. All this really means an environment of significant uncertainty, and organizations are busy developing strategies and plans to navigate through these risky conditions. So what does this really mean for the outsourcing and services market? Interestingly, we are seeing a decoupling of the IT BPS industry from GDP growth. Historically, the IT BPS market tracked very closely to GDP, as you see here. But in recent years, as we recover from the global pandemic, the IT BPS industry has continued its growth trajectory, even as economies showed signs of weakness. This really demonstrates a great resilience in the outsourcing and services market. And we continue to feel quite bullish about the steady demand for these services going into the near future.
Shirley, that's very interesting. If I may ask one question, right? This decoupling phenomenon is really interesting. But why do you think this decoupling is happening?
I think it's a part of the maturing of the outsourcing and services market. There's a wider recognition of the advantages and benefits that outsourcing can bring, and we'll talk about that a little further on in this webinar. And certainly, when we think about the impacts of the global pandemic, there was a great appreciation of how outsourcing helped organizations through global shutdowns and the transition to remote working. It was pretty widely recognized that those that went through the outsourcing journey kind of was able to weather through those disruptions a lot more successfully and effectively than those that may not have. And so that added to that robust business case that organizations need to think about, transferring work outside and externally to providers.
Right.
So given, the focus of this webinar, Pratik, can you double click really on how this picture looks for the business process services part of the ITS BPS market, basically the slide shown here?
Thanks, Shirley. So as we can see from the data that our financial research team tracks, we expect the BPS market to be more resilient versus the ITS market. And if you would see the September 22 quarter numbers, we saw a slight dip in the ITS segment by 1.6 percentage points. However, if we contrast that to BPS, it was largely consistent in terms of the growth. Now, just double clicking on this, why this is so. So BPS spend is not a discretionary spend for organizations. It's an ongoing, it impacts the ongoing operations. And over the years, we have seen that it has proven to be outsourcing has proven to be a mature tool in terms of driving some of the cost optimization initiatives and achieving accelerated value, especially during some of these economic downturns or uncertainty type of situations. Now, unlike the previous disruptions, whether it be the global financial crisis or the COVID disruption, which were black swan events and not really anticipated or expected by the organizations, this time around, the economic downturn, looking at all the leading indicators, it is expected. And we do expect organizations to continue to use outsourcing as a lever to drive some of the cost optimization initiatives. Now, linking back to our second point, again, during economic uncertainty, everyone wants to save costs, and outsourcing is a proven tool that helps organizations.
So Pratik, if I may kind of ask one more question here, right, before we get into the poll. Of course, BPS is a kind of a category of different market in itself, right? HR, you can kind of optimize your cost on the HR side. You can optimize on the finance side, and the marketing side, and industry specific, so on and so forth. There are multiple things, right? What do you think is going to be the impact of this likely recession on these various sub-segments, if I were to call it, various functional areas that can that can potentially be addressed through BPS?
That's an interesting question, Rajesh. So while at an overall, we do expect the BPS market to grow and remain resilient. However, there are segment-specific nuances that come into play, especially during economic uncertainty. So for example, areas like FCC, financial crime and compliance, they gain increased prominence. And we do expect such segments to grow faster than some of the mature segments, HR, F&A, which while would still grow, but there's the growth is expected to be slightly muted. And I think on the other hand, there are also a lot of nascent or niche segments wherein outsourcing as a lever has been underutilized. And some of these segments include our marketing BPS areas, supply chain management BPS. So our prediction is that these segments will continue to gain momentum and see increased outsourcing as organizations continue to tackle with economic uncertainty.
Great.
So Rajesh, I think on this point, you also have an interesting question that you would want to ask the participants. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and this is a kind of poll question, guys. Hopefully you are able to see the poll question on your screen. The question is, from your perspective, what changes are you planning to make with regards to your BPS outsourcing spend, right? There are 5 options. And again, as Prateek was mentioning, we understand that some of these things are going to differ depending on what functional areas that you are responsible for, potentially the size of the organization, potentially the geographies that you are in, the pain points that you have, so on and so forth. But we do want to kind of understand from at this particular audience how they are expecting, what are they planning to make decision around their BPS outsourcing spend. So we have the polls coming through, and I think we will take a few more seconds before the results pop up. And by the way, just to kind of give you a preview, while we are kind of seeking this opinion from you, we also did a kind of a large survey to kind of understand from various organizations what's their likely decision be for 2023. So that will come through on the next slide. But I think we have the decision, right? We have at least the poll results here. Okay, it's kind of interesting. Nearly flat, increase moderately. So a significant chunk of people, 77%, are saying either it's going to be nearly flat or increase moderately, right? Interestingly, no one is saying that it will decrease significantly, and between decrease moderately, increase significantly, there's a kind of a equal split. So which is kind of, if you go to the next slide, no, I think, because this sample set is suggesting this. It's kind of interesting, right? This particular, as we talked about this bigger sample set that we kind of surveyed, seems similar, right? Pretty much similar. So it's kind of consistent to what we have been observing in some of our expectation as well. But Shirley, Prateek, do you have any kind of reaction to this?
I think it does look similar, actually. The only kind of difference is that the little bit of a flip between nearly flat and increased moderately. And I think that's explainable due to the self-selection of the people that have decided to join this webinar. because they're actively thinking about, their plans and reviewing rather than kind of maintaining a status quo. So we certainly would expect that there would be more action-oriented responses than those that just kind of want to keep things the way they are. So.
Okay, great. So, so with that, let's kind of talk about what's the kind of a priorities do we see enterprises, or rather say, what do you think enterprises are prioritizing in 2023? Shadi, do you want to kind of talk, or rather, Pratik, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, Rajesh. So I think before moving on to the priorities, I would first like to spend some time on the challenges that enterprises are facing, or the challenges that they expect to face in this coming year. And the results are not surprising at all. So given the current inflationary environment, price and cost pressures are at the top of the mind for enterprises, and you would see it in the survey results as well. So in terms of the outcomes of the survey, while price and cost pressure has been consistently featured among the top 3 priorities, this year it has taken center stage, and organizations are focused on unlocking cash and optimizing their working capital to have liquidity. And so again, just reiterating the point that cost pressure continues to be the challenge in this coming year. Now, I'll also like to talk about some of the other challenges which have been featured prominently in this year's survey. And while adapting to evolving customer needs and models is also consistent and has been featured since the last 3 years, one thing that came out strongly in this is the slowdown in demand that a lot of enterprises are facing. And while this was not a challenge which organizations were expecting in the previous 2 years, despite all the uncertainties, pandemic-induced disruption, this is something that is increasingly coming into play. And I kind of recall one of the conversations that we are having with a global apparel provider, and in anticipation of the pent-up demand, they had ramped up their production over the last year, and now they're struggling with unsold inventory, which, if you would see, again leads to increased costs for them and kind of exacerbates their price or the cost pressures that they're facing currently. So now, surely another, I think, interesting point to note is the talent and skill shortage aspect. So it was a top priority for 2022, or top challenge for 2022, and it's still a major, I would say, challenge that enterprises continue to face. So any point of view that you would like to share on that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. In prior recessions, usually you'll see talent shortage issues become alleviated quite substantially. And that is actually a different situation and scenario to the current recessionary environment that we're looking at. And so it's unsurprising that talent and skill shortage still feature as one of the top 3 business challenges going into 2023, despite the economic uncertainty. We have seen some large organizations, particularly in the tech sector, that have announced workforce layoffs. And as you said, Pratik, a lot of this is perhaps driven by a overhiring situation because they really had overly optimistic projections coming out of the pandemic. But the reality is that unemployment levels are still much lower than job openings, and several core indicators such as these suggest that there's still a very strong demand for talent, particularly in skill sets that have always been very hard to find. So there's a lot of mixed signals that are coming from what we see in the talent market compared to what we traditionally see in a recessionary or near recessionary environment. And that just kind of adds to the great uncertainty that businesses are operating under.
Thanks, Shirley, for sharing that perspective. So now moving on to the top priorities for enterprises going into 2023. And again, with all cost pressure being a challenge, naturally, their primary focus area is driving cost optimization to mitigate the challenges. And we have seen many organizations enforcing budget cuts across various spend categories, minimizing discretionary spend as well. However, these tactical shifts may not be enough given the extent of economic uncertainty that we are looking ahead into. And this has forced enterprises to adapt their cost strategies and aligning it with the changing market dynamics as well as customer preferences. So this requires a radical shift, and wherein the focus is in terms of focusing your resources as well as your investments on strategic areas to streamline costs and streamline or use technology as a lever to kind of manage some of the non-strategic work. And productivity improvements continues to be one of the levers or one of the focus areas for enterprises, whether it be through streamlining your processes, eliminating any inefficiencies through the use of various process mining tools and technologies that are coming up in the market, or whether it be through automation or RPA-based solutions to remove some of the manual processes that are there. With that, I hand it back to you, Rajesh.
Sure. If you can move to the next slide. So, just taking a step back, we understood the overall picture in terms of what is happening in the economy. In a way, all of us kind of know about it. We also understood how that is likely to impact BPS. We also understood, what are we seeing as enterprises' key challenges and priorities going into 2023, or actually in 2023. So what do they do, right? Clearly, in the past, outsourcing has been a lever, right? And the question is, how should they be thinking about this lever? How should they be thinking about some of the maturation that has happened in the outsourcing in the BPS space? And that's the place where we are looking to answer two key questions. One is, how does outsourcing help organizations weather economic uncertainties? And what benefits can organizations capture by increasing their outsourcing maturity? So Shirley, do you want to kind of take the first question?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I was in a really large global organization working on a strategy to address challenges from the global financial crisis at that time. So I think that kind of dates me and reminds me of how old I really am compared to some of you maybe on this call. But during that time, what came to mind was a quote from Churchill that said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," right? So the uncertainty at that time exposed operational vulnerabilities, which really provided the impetus for my company to execute on transformation initiatives that we really knew we should have done sooner, frankly. So as a result, by going through those transformational efforts, our company emerged from that crisis as a much more robust and resilient organization. And one of those major initiatives that we embarked on was to outsource business processes across many of our functions. The benefits of outsourcing are many. They're highlighted here, and I won't go through all of them. But most organizations embark on an outsourcing journey to achieve scale efficiencies. And what's talked about a little bit less often than the cost impact is to obtain access to the best practices and the methodologies that their providers gain from working with many clients, right? So there's also benefits around providers having faster ramp ups because they have expertise in hiring and recruiting, particularly in entry-level type of roles. And there's this ability on the flip side to ramp down much faster if, you know, volumes and demand drops as well. So in addition, you know, I talked a little bit about the kind of best practices. There's also the investment in technology, so applications, tools, systems that providers are able to better justify in their business cases because they have a one-to-many model, and their clients can really tap into to that access to best in breed types of tools through the outsourcing model. And then beyond that, that kind of continuous improvement. So many organizations gain more value by embedding, you know, explicit mechanisms to drive investments in productivity. So for example, building in percentage reductions on the deal price or gain sharing when improvements are being made. So one thing that I do also kind of want to mention that's quite important, particularly in periods of uncertainty, is the ability to transfer operating and financial risk to a third party. That is particularly attractive when you're not completely sure what's going to happen next. So, you know, what does a typical outsourcing journey look like? Prateek, I know you've been doing a lot of work with our clients in the finance and accounting and procurement space. Anything that you can maybe share as far as insights on what that typical journey looks like?
And sorry, Prateek, before you get on to this, you know, one of a very interesting question that I got, right, which kind of relates to this, relates to the context that we set. And Shirley, you talked about outsourcing as a lever. But one of the realities in the last 12, 18, 24 months has been this great resignation, attrition, right? So even if you kind of outsource, one of the things that came along is if you don't have the persistent team, it can impact the quality of service, right? So the question is, hey, what about attrition rates? Where do you foresee attrition going in the future, given the environment we talked about? Shirley, you want to kind of take a shot at it?
Yeah, we certainly expect that some of that pent up kind of movement, organizational movement that we've seen after the global pandemic to subside a bit. So attrition rates should be falling across the board. And that should alleviate some of the pressure. But like I mentioned before, demand for hard to find skill sets is always going to be there. And organizations are always going to have a challenge trying to keep their best people. And so more and more, you know, there's still quite a bit of investment in place to try to retain and engage and try to elicit the best out of the existing workforce that they have, because attrition is expensive, right? But in short, we do think that attrition rates should fall, which will help with some of the talent challenges that organizations are facing.
Yeah, I mean, based on some recent results that we are tracking, you know, things that we are kind of observing, it is already going down among some of the large outsourcing providers. So that should also give a little bit more comfort, right, for organizations who have already done outsourcing, organizations who are thinking about outsourcing.
Yeah, and just
sorry,
to add
Prateek, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to add on to that, Rajesh, so we have seen increased focus both from the enterprise side as well as from the service provider side to mitigate the impacts of attrition. So over the years, we have seen and organizations focusing strongly on knowledge management kind of initiatives. And change management, not only in terms of outsourcing, but change management in terms of resources as well when it comes to their outsourcing engagements. And this is where we see them working together as well. And we see enterprises being concerned about the development of the outsourced resources as well, and not just looking at their in-house talent.
Got it. Yeah.
So now moving on to the question, Shirley, which you asked with regards to what does a typical journey look like from an outsourcing standpoint. So typically we see organizations moving their transactional work across the various BPS processes first. And here we have an illustrative example for F&A. So if looking at the entire F&A value chain, covering processes, procure to pay, order to cash, and record to report. So typically we see enterprises starting with, I would say, the more stable processes, if you would want to call that. So P2P, within P2P, you have accounts payable, travel and expense. And when we talk about the order to cash process, activities such as accounts receivable are typically the ones that we see organizations start with. And within the record to report space as well, we see activities such as general accounting being the first ones to get outsourced. Now, as the enterprises gain confidence in the service providers' abilities to deliver these services, we see them taking more risks, and based on the discussions or the performance of the service provider, we do find them adding additional scope of work, and which is not just focused on some of the tactical or transactional activities, but including a lot more of the judgment intensive and strategic processes as well. So within F&A, you would find enterprises increasingly seeking support from service providers in areas such as treasury and risk management, budget and forecasting, tax, and even the regulatory compliance and reporting aspects as well. And this is consistent with what we see in other BPS areas as well. So if you take the example of HR, typically you would find them out starting with payroll and employee services, and then moving up the value chain.
Yeah. Prateek, one interesting question actually that was shared by Mario, earlier itself, I believe while he was registering for the webinar is, please describe any risk related to BPS outsourcing for organizations that may not have well-documented processes and SLAs, right? So they get onto the phase journey that you described. But what kind of risk and what kind of a addressable mechanism that have come along?
Well, Rajesh, I think that's an interesting question, and kind of reminds me with a conversation that I was having with the GBS head of a global tech company. So they're facing a similar situation. While their initial focus was on growth, back offices were not a priority for them. And their state was, I would say, in a very bad state, if you, for the lack of, or kind of using an extreme word here, but I'm quoting him verbatim here. So they had two options: whether they do it themselves, streamline all the processes, and then look for other levers, like look at other providers to take on those processes. However, they chose a different path. They sat down with the service provider, started, again, going back to the journey, started with the procure to pay and order to cash processes. Over the years, they stabilized them, got consistent service delivery, defined the SLAs, primarily focused on the operational aspects. And once those were stabilized, they undertook a big consulting kind of an exercise to define the future state of their finance organization. And as an outcome of which, they decided to further outsource significant scope within the record to report space as well. So I would say there are risks involved, but if you have your outsourcing contract aligned with your requirements and the expectations are set, so I think then both the enterprise and the service provider can be on this journey together and help streamline the processes and get some of those SLAs also in place. And service providers have a lot more experience, I would say, in terms of managing these processes, bring a lot of best practices also along with them. So while considering the risks, this is also an opportunity for them to further engage with service providers.
Yeah. So, I mean, for sure, if you already have well-documented processes, it's a big plus, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't have it, and I think what Pratik is saying is you are not in a kind of a unique situation. A lot of organizations are actually in that situation, or were in that situation. And then they worked along with the provider in various constructs to kind of overcome that. Now, what has happened in the last few years, that there are these tools and technologies that have come along, right? Process mining is one of them, right? Which kind of helps you really uncover what is really going on beyond the documentation. So even if you have good documentation, no one is following you, that's not the process, right? So the opportunity here is harness some of those tools and technologies, either on your own or in conjunction with your partner, provider, right? To kind of capture some of those things defined to be and get onto this. So, I mean, if I were to kind of venture and say, I think the risk of not having well documentation has gone down dramatically, both because of the maturity of how providers have dealt with, as well as advent and utilization of these new age tools that are working very nicely. In fact, the transition time and all those things have come down dramatically because of these tools, technologies, methodologies, and processes that have been developed and matured.
Definitely, Rajesh. And another question that we keep hearing from enterprises is, how do we achieve more business value from our outsourcing engagements? So now tying it back to the journey that we just discussed. So typically we see many of the organizations still falling in the lagging or the operational bucket when it comes to their maturity, where the focus is on running end-to-end processes, and in terms of performance, tracking your operational metrics, whether it be accuracy related or timeliness related. However, as the organization matures and as they gain more trust in the service providers' capabilities to provide or manage their operations, we have seen organizations increasingly outsourcing a lot more strategic processes. So we have the procurement example here. So we see organizations being more comfortable in outsourcing some of the supplier risk and compliance management aspects, managing their tail spend, e-sourcing activities, and tying it back to our journey. To achieve true value or outcomes through their engagement, we see them outsourcing a lot more of their strategic processes as well. So from a procurement perspective, it would be outsourcing their category management for some specific categories, or sourcing, driving innovation within their sourcing operations, leveraging the best practices and the expertise that service providers bring along with them.
Yeah. So I think as far as, and I know that you shared a procurement example here. I think when you think about some of the other business processes or functions, that maturity levels are largely the same. And I know you'll talk a bit more about the operating model components of how that looks across the different types of maturity in the slide here. But I did kind of want to say that the actual, examples of the different types of business processes along the bottom, that should be an exercise that organizations should kind of go through for themselves in terms of determining the readiness of being able to transfer some of this work to external parties. That will look a bit different for each function.
Definitely, Shirley. Also, while we discuss the scope aspect when it comes to outsourcing, maturity is not just defined with regards to scope of services. An organization needs to look at the other operating model components as well. So as you move up the value chain and have a more strategic intent when it comes to your outsourcing engagement, organizations need to also look at how is their digital strategy aligned along with the scope of services that they are outsourcing. So are they, going back to the question, Rajesh, so are you outsourcing or are your current processes still unstructured and manual processes, and you're just moving those same processes to a service provider, or do you already have a digitally enabled ecosystem in place? Similarly, from a delivery model perspective, as you outsource more strategic services, are you delivering it still from offshore locations, wherein those strategic processes may require regional nuances and close proximity to your in-house teams? So the point here being, all your operating model components need to be in line with where you are on the maturity curve. Otherwise, it would become difficult to achieve the desired or the expected business value that you are expecting in terms of your outsourcing engagements.
Yeah. And one of the questions, if you can address, which is kind of relates to some bit of digital transformation, but essentially it is focused on automation. So the question specifically is, with lack of resources and the talent issue, continue to be there in one form or another, to what extent automation has matured, right, in terms of its adoption, so on and so forth, right? That's the question. So let me kind of address this, because I've been part of some of these studies and conversation. For sure, automation, and I would say not the kind of the RPA part of just the RPA part of the picture, but this intelligent automation has become a very important component of how do we think about capturing value, right? For sure. Now, the other part of the reality also is there are organizations who have had, I would say, mixed results. They tried this in a pilot basis, they got certain successes, but they were not able to scale that up. And unless you're able to scale that up, you can't really capture the value, both from a cost perspective or, there are other, elements of value capture, you can't. But having said that, there are enough and more number of organizations that have been able to really scale intelligent automation adoption. And there are various reasons why they have been able to do that versus others. But the short answer is two things. Clearly, automation has to be part of your deal construct, has to be part of your solution construct. And secondly, don't think about automation as just a way to kind of, capture a few things. You got to think it from a scale perspective and think about what is the way in which you can deploy that at scale to create that, what we call touch and tech combination, right? Human machine combination, and capture the value that we possibly can.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Rajesh. And also with some of all the digital levers coming into play, and as organizations move up the maturity curve, I think change management becomes an important aspect. So Shirley, and any perspective on how organizations can look at change management with regards to outsourcing?
So change management is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, because it's painful, but so incredibly necessary. There's many starting points, as we all know, for organizations to move to an outsourcing model. But really, the success is determined by how committed the organization is to making, all the changes that's necessary to, the impacted processes. Leadership needs to be committed to the outsourcing model, and that includes retaining management accountability over their business processes, even when day-to-day operations is actually being performed by a third party. So that's an interesting balance. Failure can happen even in the most seemingly ideal situations without effective change management. During the decade that I've had leading strategic and transformation within a large global organization, I've seen firsthand how important change management is to achieving the objectives and benefits that's expected through outsourcing. You need to run an assessment of the organizational or process readiness for outsourcing to identify the risks and plan properly to mitigate those. So we talked about that a little bit earlier in the webinar. Organizations need to be exceptionally careful when considering outsourcing processes that are truly broken. So it doesn't have to be totally documented, as Rajesh was, kind of mentioning, and you guys were discussing earlier. But at the same time, when even the most basic tasks can't be successfully executed on a repeatable basis, that's an indicator that the organization itself really doesn't understand enough about its own requirements to be able to help their third parties and their service providers pick up the scope of work and meet their expectations, right? But so it's a balance, and it is, you do need to take those types of readiness assessments. If there's situations where, the system environment might still be in flux, and there's major system changes that are happening, it's probably best to wait a little bit, because there are potential errors that can arise, and difficulty attributing where that error is coming from, whether it's coming from the system or the delivery model, changing simultaneously. It's really hard to kind of pinpoint. So that just increases overall complexity and potential, implementation costs as well. One thing I do want to note is we've talked a lot about the benefits and advantages of outsourcing, but there are disadvantages as well. And often there's a real or just a perceived loss of control that can lead to poor performance outcomes. And there are, performance can also be impacted by higher attrition rates. And it's a reality that we typically see higher attrition in outsourcing compared to those in in-house types of roles. There's overhead costs that's associated with governance and reporting that also needs to be properly budgeted. So effectively managing organizational expectations through the outsourcing journey is incredibly important to be able to sustain the outsourcing model in general. I think at this point, since I talked about attrition, there has been a question that has come through about what level of attrition rates are we typically expecting. I think this always varies by geography. The market rates, the typical market rates for attrition can be quite high in certain geographies and lower in others. I'm not sure that we're actually going to see a halving, like a slash of half in attrition across the board. We're also seeing some changes in demographic expectations as well, in terms of kind of how long they expect to stay in a particular organization. That's also influencing attrition too. One thing I can say is that we do have a research team that looks at attrition by location and geography. And if any organizations are looking for more of that detail, we have teams that can help in a more specific kind of way.
Yeah.
So,
and Shelly, if I were to just add to that, right? I think we talked about the various factors. One of the other important factors, which possibly is subsumed into what you talked about, is also the function, the area, the skill set, right? The CXM side versus the F&A side. Even in the BPS, you'll see kind of a difference, right? So we need to kind of look at multiple things to be able to kind of say, okay, this is attrition. But more importantly, if this is attrition, the equally important question is, that's a reality, right? How do we kind of work our way right, to kind of still get the value, capture the value. The good news, of course, as we talked about, is the attrition. We see the trend going down, but to your point, it's not going to go away.
Yeah, and I think there's another question that kind of talks about where the talent shortages are most experienced. What kind of geographies have that hit the most? We saw the demand gap most relevant in geographies, established geographies like the U.S., like Canada, and Poland, where a lot of business process work is being delivered out of, as well as in emerging geographies such as Colombia and Brazil. We've also seen difficulty sourcing adequate talent there, but it's not across the board. So India was largely, from an F&A point of view anyways, still pretty moderate when it came to talent shortages. We've seen pretty good availability in Jamaica, Indonesia, and other types of places. So like I said, and like what Rajesh reminded, is that talent is not uniform. You need to look at the domain and the specific capabilities. You also need to take a look at the locations itself. And as a research firm focused on location data, that's something that we keep a close eye on throughout the year. So if we could just head back to that once, yes, thank you. So I actually haven't talked about this slide at all. Some of you, may be more in the second or third generation or more of your outsourcing journey. So navigating through economic uncertainty involves driving further value through addressing some of the common sources of value leakage. And we've listed some of those here. It could be, reducing costs through increasing self-service and leveraging automation further, and digital transformation, as what Rajesh and Pratik kind of talked about. It could be re-examining delivery location mix and looking at the talent issues that we just discussed now. It could even mean rationalizing your suppliers, because consolidating work to a common supplier can often result in better rates and better terms that you can get. And speaking of terms, reviewing those terms and potentially renegotiating those rates where it makes sense. There was a question that came through where are we seeing service providers raising their rates to retain talent? And certainly we saw that in 2021 and 2022 as well. However, we do think that with the onslaught of the recession, those conversations are probably not going to be as successful as it had been previously. So with that, I know we're running out of time. I just wanted to pass it over to Rajesh to bring us home.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shirley. Just to kind of again summarize, right? What are the 5 action items that we are suggesting you guys to, again, not only manage, navigate, but create that business value? And you may be a first-time outsourcer, you may be an existing outsourcer, right? You may be already outsourcing, or you may be kind of thinking about outsourcing, but some of those things are kind of applicable. So the first one, which we kind of talked about, right, is an opportunity to review your existing business processes and see if there's potential to increase scope for outsourcing. And that could be within existing function. There's new areas that we have not tapped into, but there's an opportunity because maturity has increased, service provider capabilities have improved significantly, and hence, or it could be an area that you have not looked into the past, but now is a good time to look at. Of course, the thing that we talked about around attrition and the pricing part of the picture, yes, there's an opportunity to optimize existing outsourcing spend due to falling attrition rate and the subsequent reduction in overall overhead cost, right? Which will potentially offset some of the inflationary cost pressures. Opportunity to kind of establish linear contract, look at the talent, the shoring, the team structure, so on and so forth. And this is also an opportunity to kind of look at, hey, what kind of a risk that we have, both from our outsourcing portfolio perspective, as well as from a offshoring location perspective, right? One of the, again, insights that we got as part of the survey is we see a lot of enterprises looking at 2023 as a year to rebalance their portfolio, in fact, consolidate their vendor portfolio, provider portfolio. Lastly, as Shirley kind of mentioned right in the beginning, never let a good crisis go waste. This is also a great opportunity to recalibrate our strategic priorities for the long term, right? Again, we all know that there are certain things that get done and get done with urgency during these times than in normal times. So utilize that opportunity. Really is a great opportunity from that perspective. Okay, so with that, if we can move to the next page. I know we got a lot of these questions around, the rates, where are they moving and all those things, guys. Here's an offer, right? So we are offering you this service level rate compare for 3 roles from a set of 3 functions. So any function that you can pick, and you can pick 3 roles in that function, or you can spread that across 3 functions, meaning 1 role in each function across 3 countries from a set of 6 countries. Right? That's an offer for you. It's an offer just meant for enterprises. And I hope, you will kind of leverage that and answer, or start to get some of those perspectives and answers that you're hoping to get. Okay. With that, I'll pass it back to kind of conclude this webinar.